In this demo, I'll be configuring an elastic IP address, otherwise called an EIP. So, an EIP is its own resource in Amazon Web Services. Simply stated, it's a static or unchanging public IP address that you can associate with an instance. Then the instance has an unchanging public IP address, and if your needs dictate that as a requirement, such as hosting a custom website manually within an EC2 instance and you don't want its identity to change in terms of its IP, well, then an elastic IP address is the way to do it. But you want to be careful because here in the console, if I go to the VPC management console, and if I were to look at the properties of a subnet, one of the properties of a subnet is whether IPv4 public IPs are auto-assigned when instances are launched into the subnet. This one currently says no, but I could easily just go to Actions, Edit Subnet Settings, and turn that on. And what that would do is, as it states, it would assign a public IPv4 address to the instance whenever it runs. But the thing is, it changes. Every time you stop and start that instance, it might get a different public IP address. It almost assuredly will. And that might be okay. It really depends on what you're doing with that instance and why it needs to be publicly accessible. So if I were to go to the EC2 management console, and if I were to take a look at an existing instance and click on it, I can view not only its private IP address information, but also its assigned public IPv4 address. Now, in this case, it is not an elastic IP address. I know because I've configured this virtual machine and the subnet into which it was launched. This IP address changes every time I start it up. So therefore, it's not an elastic IP. But let's say I need it to be consistent, even between invocations of the VM. Every time I stop it, start it for however long I choose, when it comes up, I want it to have the same public IPv4 address. Well, then you need to create an elastic IP address resource and associate it with this VM. Now, while I'm here in the EC2 management console, on the left, if I scroll down under Network and Security, this is where I will find elastic IPs. Now, you want to make sure you don't just allocate elastic IP addresses, which means create them here and not use them because you're paying for them. So if you're going to allocate an elastic IP address, make sure you need it, and then, of course, associate it with the appropriate instance. So I'm going to start here by clicking Allocate Elastic IP Address. I'll leave the network border group for US East 1. That's the region in which I want that available. It's going to come from Amazon's pool of IPv4 addresses. Now, there are ways, if you are a larger enterprise or government agency, you might have a pool of public IPv4 addresses that are allocated to your organization or your agency. And so you can create those as configured IP address pools here in Amazon Web Services and then reference them when you create an elastic IP. But in this case, it'll just be supplied from Amazon's pool of public IPv4 addresses. I'm just going to scroll down to the bottom right and I'll click Allocate. So what I've done is allocated or created an elastic IP address resource. Having it selected, if I go to the Actions menu, I can release it, which really means deleting it. I'm releasing it back to the Amazon pool, thus I would not incur charges. However, I'm going to associate that elastic IP address to my instance. Now notice you can associate it with either an instance or a specific network interface. So I'm going to click in the instance field, and I've got my Windows Server 2022-1 VM up and running. So I'm going to select that. I could choose to associate this public IP with a specific private IP, but I'm just going to associate it with the instance. I can choose whether this elastic IP can be reassociated to other resources in the future. I can change that after the fact. In this case, I'll just choose Associate. So notice that this public IP address, this elastic IP, starts with 34.232. So if I go to my instances view, to my instance that I've assigned that to, it immediately uses the elastic IP. So its previous publicly assigned IP at the subnet level, which was dynamic, it could change every time it starts, is no longer used. Instead, the elastic IP address has replaced it. Now, this is a static IP which will not change. Let's just verify this. I'm going to go ahead and copy that and I'll paste it into WordPad. This is the elastic IP public IP address. I'll paste it here so I don't forget it. Now, back here in the instance properties, I'm going to go to the instance state button. I'm going to stop the instance. All we want to do is test that after we stop it and then restart it. Will it have the same or a different public IP? Well, it should have the same one. That's the whole purpose. It's in the midst of being stopped. I can click the refresh button. And after a moment, it now shows as stopped. So I'll just put the check mark to the left of it, go to instance state and start the instance up. I'll just click the refresh button. Notice it's running. Notice the instance state is pending, so it's in the midst of firing up. Okay, so now the server is running. It's still initializing, but if we select it, it's pretty apparent that it's still using the same public IPv4 address, and therein lies the purpose of an EIP.